Hey guys, so welcome to the video. I'm from the Salesforce team, and today we're going to talk about Lightning attributes and how do you use Lightning attributes in your Lightning components. So you can refer to what Lightning attributes are from the Salesforce websites. So inside Lightning components, Lightning attributes are like your variables which can be used to store data inside your Lightning components. And then you can use these attributes inside your component markup, in your JavaScript, and all that stuff. So you can go to our website, go to the Salesforce Lightning section, and click on the topic called Lightning Attributes to study more about them. Now, let us go to our development org, right? And let us create one component to demonstrate how Lightning attributes work. So let me open this up in the same tab. All right, so here is our developer console. So let's close this and let's create a new Lightning component. And we are going to call it attribute example. You can name it as attribute example and just click on submit. Right, okay. So since we discussed that Lightning attributes are like your variables, so obviously a variable also has a type associated to it. Our variable could be of the string, of a number type, and whatever you want to do. So let's try and create our first attribute with the same syntax as this one. So the syntax to create your attributes is inside your markup, you define an attribute as aura dash attribute. You specify what type of attribute it is. So let's say I just want to take it as a string type attribute, and then you have to give a unique name to your attribute. So let's call this one text, and then you can close the markup. Now you have successfully defined this attribute inside of a Lightning component. Now let's say we want to assign a default value to this attribute. So for doing that, you can use another keyword here called default, and you can assign whatever default value you want to assign to this attribute. So when this component is rendered on a page, you should be able to see this value inside your attribute named text. So now once you have defined this attribute in your line number 3 in your first line, how do we use this attribute inside of our markup? So this is something similar which is followed in your Visual Force as well. So to use this attribute in your markup, you need to follow a merge field syntax, and that syntax works like this. You have to do a curly bracket and exclamation mark, and then you specify the attribute by its name by doing v dot and your attribute name, which is text, and then you close your curly bracket. So this v dot actually represents the value of this attribute, and anywhere you want to use or attribute in your markup, you always have to use v dot with the attribute name. If you do not use the v dot, this is not going to work. So let's say how this looks like when we print it in an application and preview it. So go to File, New, create a Lightning application. Let's call this attribute example app. Click on Submit. And then inside the markup of your application, you're going to use our attribute called attribute example. So you type in C colon attribute example and I save this. So now we can preview this. So when I preview this component, it is loading up right now. Okay, so now you see when the component is printed on the, is loaded up in the browser, you see this hello world is printed out on the component. Why it did that was, so let's go back to our lightning component. So we had defined an attribute of the name text, right? And this text had a value of hello world. So now when I put this text attribute in my markup like this, so when this component is loaded up in your Visualforce page, or not Visualforce page, in your browser, so the attribute is replaced by the value which was assigned to the attribute, which was your hello world. So this is how it works. Oops, sorry. All right, so let's go back to our attribute example. So this is how you use your attribute in your component markup. But this is all right. You can use your Apex variables in Visualforce like this as well. But what makes this different from your Salesforce classic Visualforce pages? So let's say we define an input field here. Let's say we say it as lightning input. So this lightning input is a standard field, standard component provided by the lightning framework to be used as input fields. And we put a label to it and we call it my input. And then we do one thing, we bind the value of this input field again to the attribute right here called text. So the way we do that is we use this value attribute in your lightning input and we equate it, or we use its value as v.text again. So this syntax is the same, just as you use the attribute on your markup, you can use it the same way in your lightning input as well. And then what I do, we close this. So now let's go back to our page and refresh it. So here something interesting happens. So now we have this hello world which is being printed out from our markup like in a static way, and then we also have this my input and this input field of ours, and this input field also has the value from our attribute which is hello world. So let's say what we do now is we change the value of the attribute in my input field. So you'll notice one interesting thing, that when you change the attributes value from your input field, it also gets changed in the markup. So what that means is, if you change the value of the attribute from your input field or in anywhere of your lightning component, the updated value is reflected back everywhere the attribute is used. So we changed the attributes value from this input field. As soon as this text value is updated from a lightning input, the value of this attribute, updated value of this attribute is reflected everywhere. So it is also reflected in our markup. So again, we go here and we type in Salesforce thrillers. So now our attributes value is Salesforce thrillers, and that is why it is also being reflected here. So this is a really major advantage of Lightning components, and this is what we call a two-way data bind or a two-way data sync, where if you change this attributes value right here, it is automatically reflected everywhere the attribute is used. This is not the case with your Visual Force because you have to re-render the section near Visual Force in order to show the updated value. So now this is like how we talked about printing your attribute here and using its value or binding its value to an input field. Now, let's say what we want to do is we don't want it to work in a two-way sync. And what we want is if we change its value here, we don't want its updated value to be reflected in other places. So in that scenario, what we can do is when you like use or print a value of your attribute in your markup, you use this exclamation mark operator, right? This exclamation mark is what tells your framework that this is a two-way data sync. So in order to change this, instead of using the exclamation mark, you can use a hash operator and then keep the rest of the syntax as same. So what this hash operator does is it is not gonna work in a two-way data sync. What I mean by that is, let's say I go back to our component. So you see when the component is loaded, the value being printed here is hello world. But if I change the value now in my input field, this value is not updated with the latest value of your attribute. I can put anything in here and this value will never change. So this happens because this hash operator does not support two-way data binding. So the way it works is you use this hash operator here. So as soon as this component is loaded up in your browser, this default value gets populated here. But then afterwards, if any other change happens in this attribute's value, that value is not reflected in your component level. All right. So this is a really good point where you need to know the difference between your hash operator while using your attributes and your exclamation operator. Okay. Now, after this, let's go back to our website. Now, so right now, what we did was we just used a string type attribute. So there are other types of attributes also which are supported by Salesforce, and these are categorized into these categories. So the first is your basic type, which consists of all of these types: a boolean, a date type, decimal, double, and all of that string. And the string type is also included into this, which we just used right now. And we can easily, let's say I'll just copy the code from here. We can easily define them the same way that we did this text type. So you'll see we define a boolean type, a date type, a decimal type, a date time type attribute, and according to what the type of your attribute is, the default value is also the default value is also set up in the same type which is supported. So for the boolean, you give the default as true. For the date, you give the default as a date, and so on. So let's save this and go back and preview this. So you'll see that all of our attributes are printed here, like the boolean, true, the date value, and everything like that. In order to do it a little better, let me add line breaks in here. So this is using these is pretty easy. And again, if if you want to bind the value of these with any input fields, you can do it the same way that you did for the string. So let's say we want to bind this boolean with a field. So what you will do is you'll do something like lightning input type equals to checkbox, and first we'll see how it is printed out in our right. So you see a checkbox is being printed out, but we haven't bound it to anything. So let's also give this a label, my checkbox, and then we bind it to our boolean attribute by again the exclamation operator, and we bind it with this like that. So now I go back here. So now you see you can check and uncheck this value and it'll be reflected in your attributes value. Alright, now these are all pretty straightforward. You have all these types and you can all use them directly in your markup or with your lightning input fields like this. It's gonna work with everything. Now let's move on to the next type of attributes, which is your standard and custom subject type attributes. So what we mean by these is instead of using an attribute of type string, you can have an attribute of a subject type, like for example, an account or a contact or anything. So let's say we create an attribute of your, or even better, let's take this example. Oops. And you go here. All right. So let's walk this through first. So when you define the attribute in your type, you just mention the subject's name. And now here is where this gets interesting. So when you are providing a default value of a subject type attribute, you need to provide your default value in the form of a JSON, and where you have your subject type field, which will say the object's name, which is account, and then you can have any account field in here with a value. So we have populated our name with the test value, then we have populated our account description with a test description. So again, I go back to our example here. So yeah, you can see that when we print out the value, the name value is being printed as v.acc, which is the name of our attribute, and then we do a dot name to access the name of this account. And this prints out our values here. Alright, so instead of using an account, you can use any other field as well, or any other standard or custom object. Instead of using just these two fields, you can use any subject field that you want. Then, okay, after this standard and custom object type attributes, you have collection type attributes, which are your arrays, list, map, and set. So these are pretty straightforward. An array is like a collection of elements. A list is also a collection of elements, but the only difference between these two is how they are defined. So let's say I take this as a list and I save it like this. So you'll see here it is defined as the array of a string. So this is why you specify string in here, and we have used the array notation. And in the default, we have also used an array notation to define all the default values for an array type attribute. And if I use the same thing with the list, I'll do the same thing here. So right here, you don't need to define the type of your collection. Like you have to specify the string here, which told the framework that this was a string type of array. You don't need to do that in your list. You can just define it as a list. You can have whatever type of elements inside your array that you want. So that is the only difference between these two. Then we'll go on here. So next we have the map and we have the set type of attributes. So these works just the same like your Apex map and set types, where a map has a unique key and a value for that key. So the map in your Lightning attributes also follows the same logic, where you need to have all the keys as unique. If you provide a new value for a key, it will override the older value for that key in your map. And the same thing goes for set. It works for the same way as an Apex, where your set cannot have duplicate values. It'll only have unique values. Alright, so now the next type of attribute is your custom Apex class type attribute. So the way this works is we go back to here. So in order to demonstrate this, let me go off this first. We'll need to create an Apex class first. So let's create a new Apex class and call it custom